You know what we're going to do now, don't you? We're going to, in our continuing series, since thankfully in the last couple of days, nobody's done or said anything egregiously stupid in the wrestling business, we've got a little time to talk about classic wrestling. And we are going to pick up where we left off and talking about what I did 40 years ago this month. We last did December 1983, which we were talking about the early formation of the Midnight Express and I, and our first full week on the road in Mid-South Wrestling. And now we're going to pick up with January 1984, and I remind everybody, you can. What's the title on YouTube of the December 1983 clip? December 1983?
It may just be Jim Cornette looks at his December 1983 schedule.
Well, you can go back and you can hear we've done a variety of months in 1983, and now we're getting to the good stuff, so you can go back and catch up on the YouTube channel, or I can simply remind you that Bill Watts had come to Memphis, seen the talent, the deals had been made. He was bringing me and Bobby Eaton and Dennis Condrey as the Midnight Express. Bill Dundee started as booker. Terry Taylor was there. Rock and Roll Express soon to follow. The Mid-South wrestling territory was down and business was bad, and that's why Watts wanted a change in the talent, the booking, etc. But from my standpoint, as I've illustrated, this was a massive upgrade. I went from being the absolute most least important person and lowest paid person on the roster in the Tennessee territory to the manager, top heel manager of the soon-to-be top heel tag team in Mid-South Wrestling. So I was making more money than I had been when we were working preliminaries every night of the week just to get over in Mid-South. So you had asked the question last time we talked about this, was I, kind of disgruntled or anything? I can't remember how you phrased it, that the towns weren't really drawing the first time we went through. I said, fuck, I'm making more money on shitty towns and preliminary matches than I was, working 5 and 6 times a night in Memphis. So I'm good. But we did get off on one wrong foot. We ended up on December 31st, 1983, when we were in Oklahoma City on that big $60-something thousand house. And we ended there because that was 1983, but we got to even up today, Brian, because my book goes from Monday to Sunday. But Sunday, January 1st, it was a Sunday. So there's 8 days this week. We're going to act like 8 days a week. Are you ready?
Not for you singing the Beatles, but ready to hear about your 8-day-a-week schedule, Hulk Hogan. Let's hear about this.
I could at least make a run at Ringo's vocals. Anyway, we left off in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma on New Year's Eve of 1983. January the 1st, New Year's Day, we're booked in Little Rock, Arkansas. And we found out at that point that from Oak City to Little Rock, it's 270 miles across the interstate. And we went there a little bit early, checked in, $27 for the motel. Spent $11 on food that day, and the manager's license for Arkansas was $15, just as a little side note. And here's the thing. This was Barton Coliseum in Little Rock, Arkansas. You remember Grand Funk Railroad. We're an American band. Sweet Sweet Connie was doing her act, right? That's the place. That's the Barton Coliseum, is where they had all the fucking rock and roll shows in the 60s and 70s, and where Connie, one of the world's most famous groupies at that point, was active. And Little Rock, you would not imagine that Little Rock, Arkansas would be as much fun as Little Rock, Arkansas was, based on the fact that it's in fucking Arkansas and it's Little Rock. But there was a variety of lovely young ladies in that town. However, almost none of them were there on January 1st, 1984. The house was $10,000, and at average ticket prices, I mean, some of the towns were different, but let's go 10, 7, and 4 for a regular Mid-South wrestling show in those days. That was, what was it? 1,800 people.
This is New
Go
Year's
ahead.
Day. What was the start time?
Started that evening. It
So
was
no
an evening
afternoon show or anything because it's New Year's Day.
No. Thank God. But there's a thing, they couldn't really set anything up on the way from Oak City to Little Rock. There wasn't anything that you could do in that direction. That's the only way we got by with it. And you hardly had time to get to Little Rock. But again, we were just in a preliminary match with Lanny Poffo and Rick Rude where we went over because Little Rock was like Oak City and Tulsa. It was furthest behind on the bicycle of the TV tapes. And I don't have this written down. I used to know it by heart. But if you shot TV in Shreveport, you shot 2 shows every 2 Wednesday nights, right? Every 2 weeks. So the first show that you shot on Wednesday night would air in Shreveport that weekend, and also probably in New Orleans and maybe another town or two. And then the following weekend, it might air in Lafayette, Lake Charles, and Alexandria. And the following weekend, it'd be over to, and Houston was early up on the thing also. But the following weekend, it might be finally out to Biloxi and Jackson, Mississippi. And then 5 weeks later, from the time it was shot, they would see it in Little Rock, Oak City, and Tulsa. That way, you could since the regular towns ran every 2 weeks, you could always go into that town with the hot fucking thing off television by booking carefully a few weeks ahead. You wouldn't have to wait because the way it was set up, something hot was always going on, right? So you just feature what was hot off the television on that week or the following week's live event at the house shows. Does that make any sense?
It makes sense how you laid it out. Does the bicycling of everything that way make sense? That's for someone else to decide.
Well, and that's the way they did it. That's the conditions that prevailed. So that's why I had to learn to keep track of not only what we did on television and on each numbered tape 240, tape 241, 242, whatever, but also I would write down when we did local promos what tapes were showing in that town the week we went into them. So we'd know what it was. Watts loved to do paperwork, and he loved to get shit, logical and details. And I picked up on that, and it was a lesson. A lot of the other guys got confused and they got yelled at. So anyway, we're in Little Rock on New Year's Day. The house is $10,000 at the giant Barton Coliseum at the fairgrounds. And again, we were thinking, well, we got a lot of room to fucking grow. It would be less than 5 months. We would go to Little Rock for the last Stampede. Not only would it be sold out, and not only were people turned away, they locked the front gates of the fairgrounds half an hour before bell time for the show so that no more people would come in and try to buy tickets that they didn't have left. And that's when we had car trouble from the afternoon show we did then, and got there so late they'd locked the front gates of the fucking fairgrounds. We had to circle the fairgrounds until we found a gate open in the back and figure out how to get to the fucking arena. And that house was $71,000, and there were somewhere around 6,000 whatever plus people. That's how you can, as the tool that Watts had that made this possible was, even if his buildings, the house shows were down, the ticket sales were down, all the wrestling fans were still watching the TV. They just needed to see something they wanted to go buy a ticket to see. And that's how you could pop a territory. If nobody was watching the television, it didn't matter what you did. Anyway, so then we got to go home. Brian, I'm sorry, no, it wasn't 270 miles from Oak City to Little Rock. It was 340 miles from Oak City to Little Rock, and then 270 miles back to Alexandria that night, where we were living at the time. So we did 610 miles and a house show in one day. That was an easy day in Mid-South.
What were your first impressions of Alexandria, and did any of the hotels you started staying in have HBO at that point?
Oh God, I can't even remember what the cable situation was like at the Alexandria Motor Inn. Because we were barely in the room anyway, and the hotel that we stayed at in Alexandria for the first month till I could find an apartment, we got a weekly rate. And then we were the situation where when we had to go to Oklahoma, we would leave our hotel room with enough stuff for the weekend trip and have an auxiliary hotel room in that city. So at one point, we may have had 3 hotel rooms at one point. I can't remember. But it was,
How do you get an apartment? Because what do you tell them? I mean, landlords want leases.
yeah.
So what do you say? Can you say, I'll give me a 1-year lease?
Well, the thing is, in some cases, back in the old days before computerized shit and all that stuff, that's what guys would do is they'd sign a lease to get an apartment. And if they got their notice or they got fired or they quit and left early, they just fucking bailed on the whole territory. It wasn't like they were moving across town where you could be found, right? They were gone to Portland. And a lot of guys didn't give a shit about their credit. I ended up
Sam Menaker took a plane.
There you go. He didn't take a plane. He stole a plane.
I'm not coming back. I'm just going to take
I'm not coming back. I'm flying your plane to my next territory. Come and get it. He did call and tell Stu where it was. He'd come and get it, right? But anyway, so I looked for an apartment and ended up getting this place. They had 6-month leases. And because it was a reconverted roadside motel, like with the outdoor, you would just park in the parking lot and it looked like a fucking old time Super 8. You just walk up to the door and go in and there was an apartment. It was a living room and dining room / kitchen in the front room. And then the bathroom and the bedroom was in the back room. It was an old hotel. And that proved to be interminable after a while, but I was at least in the thing. And I ended up switching for the second half of our stay to an actual apartment complex. It still wasn't much, but it was a regular apartment. But yeah, and I mean, I don't even have my records here on what the rent was, but we're talking rent of $300 maybe. And also, by the way, we forgot to mention the inflation calculator. Whenever I mention a dollar figure in January 1984, it's $3 today, $1 to $3. So $100 payoff was equivalent to $300. The $10,000 house that was the shits, equivalent to 30 grand on a town they ran every 2 weeks. So it added up. But anyway, we bopped back to Alexandria that night, long enough to go to bed and get up the next day and leave at fucking 2 o'clock and go to New Orleans, which, as we mentioned before, was a 400-mile round trip and ran every Monday night. And this was, again, our second week at the old downtown municipal auditorium. We beat George Weingeroff and a kid named John King, which I always got a kick out of him because that was my grandfather's name, my Mama Cornette's father.
So it wasn't just Lanny. What do you think about working with all these ICW guys that you had seen on TV and had been the enemy of the promotion you worked with?
Well, but I didn't have any heat because I was just the photographer, and it's not like George Weingeroff had, been sucker punching people in the parking lots. So
he couldn't see you.
Yeah, he couldn't see you. Can't see me. It was his original gimmick. For those of you who don't know what we're mocking, that's George Weingeroff was legally blind, but he was the son of Saul Weingeroff, the old-time Tennessee wrestler and manager. And George was a hotshot amateur in school on a regional basis, but he was legally blind. So that was his gimmick. And at any rate, the house in New Orleans that night was
his gimmick. It wasn't his gimmick. It was his life.
Well, but that's what, they would mention it. Stop it.
What's that boy's gimmick? Oh, he's
blind.
He's blind.
Legally blind. He could see shapes and shit. And up close, he could read up close. He'd look real close to it. But the house was $23,000, what I'm trying to say. It was up from Christmas night, I believe. We got $150 for a preliminary match. It was like $450. So I wasn't making $150 in Tennessee on most of the shows, working 5 times a night. So I'm still happy, but Anyway, we know that we're working these prelims and it's going to lead to, because we're already starting to do some things on TV. And that's where the problem lay. After that New Orleans show, we go back to Alexandria, right? And then the following day, January 3rd, we were booked to go back to Baton Rouge, which is literally the way we just came. You got to go through Baton Rouge to get to New Orleans, but Baton Rouge is only 2 hours. So I'm looking forward to the easy trip, right? However, that morning I had to go to the doctor because when we drove down Christmas Eve to move into Louisiana and start the tour, I had been getting what I believed was a zit in my armpit. Have I told you this story?
No.
This might be a new one even on you. I thought it was a zit. Got a bump in my armpit and it was itching me. Christmas and a few days afterwards. And boy, when we were on that weekend where we were in Oklahoma City and then in the hotel, Little Rock, whatever, I was like, God damn it. This thing's getting bigger and it's bothering me. And the boys said, well, here, heat up a piece of tape, put on it. That'll bring it to a head and you can pop it. And they're doing all these dressing room remedies. And then Bobby tried to squeeze it. I'm like, motherfucker, that hurts. And it's getting bigger, right? So I get up that Tuesday and I look in the mirror and about half of my side is turned red. And that knot's getting bigger yet. And it's like a golf ball now. And I said, Bobby, look at this. He's Corny. You might need to go to the doctor. So we find an urgent care place in Alexandria. And the doctor looks at it and says, oh, you got a staph infection. What? Yeah. Oh, see where your side is turning red? Yeah, your blood is being poisoned. You need heavy antibiotics and you may go to the hospital if you wait any longer. Oh, shit. So they told me, they said, take these antibiotics and immediately go home. They didn't know what our story was, and we were living in a fucking hotel. And put a hot heating pad and a hot wet compress on this and take these antibiotics and keep an eye on this because, you may end up in the hospital. Oh, shit. So now I've been there for a week and they have to show up. Bobby and Dennis have to show up in Baton Rouge and tell Grizzly Smith on behalf of Mid-South Wrestling, Cornette's sick. And I'm thinking they're going to say, already? And this is going to be the big one, right? But I'm in pain. I've got this infection. They said, whatever the fuck is, we'll cover for you, Corny. So I stayed there in the hotel room while Bobby and Dennis go to Baton Rouge. And I lay down, and I'm so tired anyway. I lay down in bed on this hot, wet compress with the heating pad that I've gotten. And I wake up a couple hours later and I start to turn over. And this fucking wet towel under me has got shit on it. And I look, and that fucking thing has popped. And I stand up and I'm dripping. I go over to the mirror and look in the fucking sink. And I've got a hole in the middle of that lump in my armpit. The hole that you can see into my side is as big around as the end of my little finger. And I go to squeeze this thing, right? And I hear this rumbling noise from inside, and this yellow shit comes out in the sink. And so I stood there for the better part. Are you entertained by this yet, Brian? Have you heard this one before?
I have not. I don't know where you're going to go.
Where I'm going is I stood there for 15 minutes squeezing this fucking pus out of this deal, right? I've never seen anything like it before or since. And it's sore as a motherfucker, but it quits leaking pus. So now I figure, okay, because I have to get up the next morning and go to interviews. So where I was going with this is, I know one clip you can definitely see, but if you've got any of the local promos that I shot on January 4th at any of the shows, or the angle where we come out and I call Magnum TA and Wrestling 2 a couple of chickens, and then we tar and feather Magnum TA, I couldn't put my left arm down by my side. It hurt so bad then in all of these interviews, I've got my tennis racket in my left hand and I've got it cocked over my shoulder like a fucking rifle in army formation.
I know which ones you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes. And I'm jauntily got my racket over my shoulder because I couldn't put my fucking arm down. It hurt so bad. And I had put Band-Aids over this goddamn hole in my side. And shit, blood and leakage was coming through and soaking through my shirt. And so that's why when you see me from this TV taping, I'm at the weird, unnatural angle of having my left arm at a 90-degree angle from my body, holding my tennis racket over my shoulder, like I'm a hobo with my fucking, a bag tied on a stick.
Did you do anything to clean it or have it looked at or
No,
some ointment?
no. I took the antibiotics they gave me. I wiped it off whenever I could. I sweated like a fucking whore in church at all these shows and never put any goddamn antibiotic shit on it because nobody told me to. They didn't tell me it was going to pop like that. And I made the rest of the fucking towns. I'd already taken one day off. Fuck it. Blood poisoning. What's that? So that was the January 4th. That was the day I got up at 6:30 in the morning and drove to fucking Shreveport, did a whole day of interviews. And then we did the TV tapings that night. And that's the night that we shot the first angle where we knocked Wrestling 2 out with the slapjack and tarred and feathered Magnum TA on camera, calling them chickens because they wouldn't defend the tag team title against us. And that's by the time that started showing really in most places 2 or 3 weeks later, that was the first thing we did to get real heat. And that's what led to immediately the fans found Bobby's, he had a 1976 Lincoln. We called it the USS Alabama. You had to pay 3 parking meters to park this fucking thing. One of those mid-70s Lincoln Continentals, right? And I don't know how many 100,000 miles on it that he had, but the fans found it at the Alexandria Motor Inn and tarred and feathered his car. He came out one day to go get something to eat, and there it was. It looked like a giant fucking chicken.
See, the problem is he probably wasn't as mad as Magnum TA appeared to be. And the other problem is Magnum TA looked ridiculous covered as a chicken because any movement, feathers fly off. So anytime you move, it looks like you're flapping your wings.
And he did the perfect promo because he said, I know that some of you people out there may find this remotely humorous, but I assure you that to me, it's not. And I'm telling, of course, it wasn't tar. It was Cairo syrup and feathers. But that's, that they hadn't seen anything like that on wrestling. I mean, back in the 20s in Louisiana, a number of people were tarred and feathered, not with Cairo syrup. And that's why it registered. They did things that registered with these people. I don't know that there's a long history of tarring and feathering people and running them out of town on a rail in Minnesota. It might not have connected.
You said this was a Watts idea, not a Dundee idea?
Well, see, that's the thing, is that they had done this before in Tennessee, and yeah, it worked in Tennessee back in the old days too. It got a lot of heat because people remembered, but but Watts would make the most out of everything. Remember, I talked about the blindfold battle royal. It was just a throwaway in Tennessee. Well, he made it sound more dangerous than anything you could come up with. With this, it wasn't like, oh, you made him look like a chicken with the feathers. There's Jimmy Hart running around blowing the whistle. It's like, they used to do this to a lot of your ancestors. And that got fucking heat. And that was we couldn't do it to, when Coco and Norvell came in as the PYTs, we couldn't have done it to them. We'd probably all been shot. But just the tease of the tarring and feathering down south, people were fucking pissed.
To the grumpiest babyface tag team ever.
Well, but that's why they did it to Magnum instead of Wrestling 2, because Wrestling 2 was way not sympathetic. But anyway, that was so we start at 6:30 in the morning. We drive up to Shreveport, or I did. Actually, Bobby and Dennis were still going with me at that. That was the first couple of interview sessions they made until Watts realized, well, they're not going to talk anyway. It'll make it more special if we don't see them. But so we did 6 hours of interviews, had time to eat something, and then went and did 2 hours of television, and then drove back to Alexandria and got back home at night about 1 o'clock in the morning. And then there was January the 5th. We go to Jackson, Mississippi. My first time in Jackson. And that was, if Shreveport was northwest of Alexandria, Jackson, Mississippi is northeast. And it's about 200 miles each way. So we did a 400-mile round trip. And our opponents that night, still Lanny and Rude, because Jackson was also on the later TV taping bicycle run. And that was my first time seeing the Jackson, the Fairgrounds Coliseum. That's where they traditionally ran wrestling for years and years, even before Watts, even before McGurk, when the old, George C. Culkin days and the Curtis family. And before that, the building that they ran in Jackson was another building on the fairgrounds. It was smaller. But the Jackson, Mississippi Coliseum, it was a big kind of round building, sort of reminiscent of the Mid-South Coliseum, but not as big. I think it was like 6,500 seats, let's say. But the house there was only $12,000. We made $150. Again, that's like $36,000 and $450. But it was a preliminary match, but this is another one. Not to give spoilers, we're going to be going over this in detail in the journey, but by May, when May came around, the last Stampede, not only did we sell the building out and turn them away and did $63,000, 5 times this house. It wasn't the all-time people record in Jackson, but George C. Culkin himself said the last time there were that many people in the building to watch wrestling, the house was only $18,000 because the tickets were $2 a piece. So again, we were just building. But Jackson, Mississippi was. Well, go ahead. What were you going to ask?
What did Dennis and Bobby think of working with Lanny? Because he was good, especially against his brother, I guess. But he was odd in the ring. I mean, not odd, but
unorthodox.
Unorthodox. Was he easy to work with?
Yes, because see, this was not. Lanny and Randy Savage had these 1-hour draws for the ICW World Title with all these suplexes and double sledges off the top and moonsaults, and there'd be 300 people in Frankfurt to see it, right? But Lanny's position here was he's working underneath. It's going to be an 8-minute match, bell to bell, and they're there to put the Midnight Express over. And Lanny with basics, headlock, drop down, hip toss, kickoff, arm drag, drop kick. You're fine. And Lanny wasn't there to do his stuff. He was there to get us over. And there was no conflict. And Bobby and Dennis can do anything with anybody anyway, but there was not like this intricate, set of spots that they were working out. They'd shine Lanny, shine Rude, cut Lanny off, get some heat on him, give Rude the tag because he was the rookie, and beat him. It was just to get us. So, Lanny could work regular matches as well as anybody. It was, remember I told you a story about when Dennis called the spot with Rude in one of these matches and he couldn't get it. Lanny could pick up just like that on, drop down, hip toss, body slam, drop kick, whatever, But that time that I was watching it from the outside, didn't know what the fuck was going on. Rude tags in, grabs a headlock on Dennis, and they start walking in a circle around the ring, and I can tell Dennis is calling something. They walk around the ring once. Dennis tries to start shoot him off, but then he stops, and he walks around the ring again. And then they walked around the ring a third time, and then Rude tagged back out. He had tagged in, got the headlock, walked 3 times around, and tagged back out. Afterward, I said, Dennis, what the fuck? And Dennis he'd locked up with Rude. He said, take my head. Rude got the headlock. He said, I'll shoot you off and drop down, nail Bobby, get it again. And he started to fire him off, and Rude said, what? And Dennis said, I'll shoot you off and drop down and nail Bobby, meaning jump over me, nail Bobby on the apron, turn around, get the headlock again. I'll shoot you off, drop down, nail Bobby, get it again. Rude said, I can't. Dennis said, I will throw you into the ropes. I will fall down in front of you, continue moving, strike Bobby in the face, and get the hold again. And Rude said, I can't get it. Dennis said, fuck it, tag out. Because he'd never seen these spots, but we're doing Tennessee spots and just shit on the fly. And he's green and he's a rookie and he didn't know what. But anyway.
Different ring every night?
Oh, yeah. All these buildings. The buildings that ran regularly had their own rings for good and for bad in some cases. And you had to learn the particular picadillos, which ones with the garden hose rope covers are not taped down. So if you stand up on them, it'll spin under your feet. Which ones are so tight that's like hitting a cheese grater? And which ones are so loose you feel like you're going to die every time you hit them? And you don't take a fucking bump in Laranja. And just different ring. And then spot show rings, they had different ones depending on what part of the territory they were in. But in Jackson, that's what I was going to say before, is Jackson, along with Greenville, Mississippi, Greenwood, Mississippi, Vicksburg, at the old building there, can't remember what they called it, and Biloxi, Mississippi, were all part of the George C. Culkin's towns, the Curtis family. George Curtis, the original, that was George C. Culkin. He wrestled as George Curtis and his brother Jack Curtis. And then Jack Curtis Jr. had been a name in that territory in the 70s. It was now working for Watts as a road agent, selling the merchandise and et cetera. So you always had either George or his son Gil Culkin at all these towns. And that was because Watts, in a variety of these towns, used local promoters. And sometimes it was literally that they had been in the wrestling business since way before Watts or even McGurk annexed this part of the territory, like the Culkins. And part of it was like down in Baton Rouge, where you had a local promoter like Jimmy Kilshaw, who had been there since dirt was invented. And because Louisiana especially was so political, you had to have a local guy that could get the good price on the fucking building rent, or could get the publicity, or could pay off the athletic commission inspector, or whatever the case. So there were a variety of local promoters in most of these towns. When did
you realize just how corrupt some of the local commissions were?
Well, really, just Louisiana. Arkansas, there was a commission, but you didn't have any problem. And Houston, there was a commission, the Texas Board of Inspection or whatever, but they knew what was going on. They didn't fuck with Paul Bosch. So really, the Louisiana, Watts had an in that Emil Pepe Bruno was a friend of his. When he had started running the Superdome, he got over like crazy with the Louisiana Boxing and Wrestling Commission. Watts did, because remember, wrestling had mostly been a small money business in Louisiana for the years. And boxing, they did huge because of the Superdome and blah, blah, blah. But when Watts brings big money shows in there, gets in the Superdome, drawing these huge crowds, he got over with the commission down there, and he had some friends on it. So it was more with the local political situations. And that's why they ran Laranja, they told me, because whoever owned that shitty building was politically connected over in the next fucking parish. And Houma.
It may be the most political television show because Watts was doing commentary. So he would talk about a lot of these people, and specifically like their kids. He would put over their kids because he knew what was up. He wanted to stay in good shape. He was the only promoter allowed in New Orleans, wasn't he?
Yes, because the commission would award the booking license to a particular wrestling promoter who was then allowed to book wrestling in the state of Louisiana, and there was only one. And he got it. And that's,
and it drove Vince nuts when he realized that.
It drove Vince nuts, and it was a long road to hoe for Vince to get down there. And that's, again, Louisiana was the crookedest state in the Union politically, going back to the days of The Kingfish, Huey P. Long. Every bridge in the state of Louisiana is named after a governor because it was built on the governor's brother-in-law's land. And it was all about payoffs and who knew who and who was friends with who. And that's how things got done. So, and Bill Watts had worked for Eddie Graham, who was doing in Florida, mentioning all the local politicians, and the people running for office wanted to get on the wrestling program because they had a built-in audience. And that's helped when you're renting on a regular basis a variety of buildings in the state of Louisiana owned by the cities. So it all worked together. And there was another one the following night. On January 6th, we were in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And Lake Charles had never been a big money town, but they had this brand new civic center that Watts started going to. And it was a beautiful building, but the Lake Charles Civic Center, the Fairgrounds Coliseum, all of these buildings were owned by the city or part of the state fairgrounds. And, you know, you had to protect their interests as well. What were you going to say?
Oh, no, I think you answered my question.
But that with Lake Charles, the following night, January 6th, was a Friday. Lake Charles was $6,800. That wasn't even 1,000 people at that point at their ticket prices. We made $60 a piece for beating Lanny and George Weingeroff. But with Lake Charles, that set up an interesting problem we had there because when we started getting heat and the houses started coming up, Lake Charles was a hot town. That was one of the 4 or 5 you had to keep an eye on everything. That's where that when Akbar had heat, the cops were good. It was like in Little Rock. They would give the heels about 10 or 12 uniformed police officers with batons and guns and handcuffs to walk you to the ring and back. And that was for everybody, the preliminary guys, everybody. They just said, we're going to do this because we've had so much trouble. So the fans got smart and they couldn't reach the heels through the cordon of cops surrounding them on the way to or from the ring. So with Akbar, the fans got water guns and put Drano in them and tried to shoot him in the eyes because they could cover more distance that way. Or they would try to get the guys outside the building. That's where the Freebirds had heat. They got so many of their tires cut off their car that they had to start going to the police station and have the police park their car there, have the police bring them over in a patrol car. And son of a bitch, at least one of the police cars got their tires cut that brought the Freebirds to the building. And once we had been there a couple times, started the program with Magnum and Wrestling 2, we came out one night, the cops would walk you out in the parking lot with the guard dogs or the police dogs, the big German Shepherds, right? They brought them over from the police station specifically to walk the heels to their cars. And we found that they had taken hypodermic needles and shot glue into all the keyholes in Dennis's van, and they had lipsticked all the headlights. So you turn the headlights on, you can't see. And we had locking gas caps or they'd sugar your gas tank. So Lake Charles was one. In a couple of cases, when we knew we were on last and we got the finish of our match, we decided instead of taking the time to change clothes and let the people get out the front door and around to the back, we set our bags packed with all of our street clothes and everything by the back door. When we got back from the ring, instead of turning left into the locker room, we grabbed our bags and immediately ran out in the back and jumped in the car and got out of the parking lot before the fans had time to come around back. That's just to avoid, that's what we used to call it, pulling a midnight, because when we could see trouble, even into the WCW days, we would leave our bags packed and right next to the back door where we could get out quick. And that's what we did in Altoona that night. We hadn't packed them, ahead of time, but when we had that riot with the guy that jumped over the rail, instead of sitting down, when we came back, we grabbed the bags, grabbed the shit, headed to the car. That's how we avoided the cops that night. We started by avoiding the people and then graduated to avoiding the cops. So that was Lake Charles. And by the way, Jack Curtis, this is another town that he would go to because he was on the road most of the time, full time. He was selling the merchandise at that point, but also whether it be Grizzly Smith or Jack Curtis, there was always at least one, usually both of them, because Grizzly never missed anything, that could not only be there to check up on the boys and to run the wrestling card, but also to be in the box office with the local promoters because there was not a strong element of trust with some of those fine folks. Are you ready to go on further?
Yeah.
On January 7th, that was a Saturday, we were in Alexandria, Louisiana, where we lived. We actually could sleep late and not have to drive. And we beat Lanny and Jumpin' Joe Savoldi. And the house was $8,800. And I hate to sound like a broken record, but the Rapides Parish Coliseum was a 6,000-seat building. And it was where we lived, so we like it if it would be a halfway decent house most of the time. But I don't know whether sometimes they ran it on a Sunday afternoon and it wasn't a great atmosphere. It didn't draw most of the time because it was a big building in a town that was kind of a B town. But we went from $8,800 and $100 payoff here to by the time the last Stampede came in, we sold it out, turned them away, did over $40,000 at the house, and, made a nice payoff that would be in the thousands in today's money. But at the same time, Alexandria was not a town that was going to do big business, even with the Midnight and Rock and Roll, even with the scaffold match. It wasn't big or consistent, but it was close. And it was at the fairgrounds, the Rapides Parish Coliseum, with an actual cattle barn with cattle in the back and all the livestock shows they had. And in the right weather, if it was sunny and warm, you could go out and you could talk to the cows for entertainment in the back of the building.
What'd you think of Jumpin' Joe Savoldi?
He was a good kid. He was,
the problem was his family was in the business, so he ended up just going to work with them, and that was kind of his cap.
Yeah, well, and it probably was anyway, between size and just, he was a good baby face, but there was nothing that really stood out. And while his grandfather may have revolutionized the business, I didn't see that potential there in Jumpin' Joe, but he was a nice kid.
I don't think it was his grandfather either.
What was it? Who was it?
Joe Savoldi.
The original Savoldi.
Is Mario Savoldi's brother, and they're the sons of Angelo Savoldi, who just took the name Savoldi from the famous Jumpin' Joe Savoldi.
Oh, shit. Okay, I thought that he was still... Well, see, now I'm a mark. I thought Angelo was in some way legitimately related to the original famous Jumpin' Joe Savoldi. What a mark I am. Well, in that case, fuck this kid. I'm glad we beat him.
No, that's not what I was trying to say. But you never hear about him. He worked for IWCCW,
trying to lie to me about his grandfather? Yeah, that's, he was up there, not the ICW at the Paphos, but the Savoldi's Northeastern ICW. He was there and then he was gone. And by the way, in Alexandria, the local promoter was Jimmy Kilshaw. Was that, no, or was he in he was in Baton Rouge. Who was the Rapides Parish promoter? Or no? God damn it, now I'm mixing them up. There was one in Alexandria and one in Baton Rouge. Jimmy Kilshaw was in Baton Rouge. Who? Charlie D'Amico. Charlie D'Amico was in Alexandria. And he was the one you'd see the old newspaper ads. Charlie D'Amico has brought this match back and demands a winner or whatever. I don't know that I ever met the motherfucker. For some reason, he was if you ran wrestling in Alexandria, one of these political deals, he had to be involved, but Grizzly ran the show. Jack Curtis checked up at the box office most of the time. This guy may have wandered around a time or two. Nothing stands out. But every town had one that had been there since the 50s or whatever, when the Fullers were running things. And then we finished the week. It hadn't been a bad week travel-wise, Brian, and you haven't asked me about the mileage, but New Orleans, we did a 400-mile round trip. I was off sick the day. Shreveport, 260 miles round trip. Jackson, 400 miles round trip. Lake Charles, 200 miles round trip. And we were in Alexandria. So that wasn't a bad travel week, was it? Just short trips. But on Sunday, Oklahoma City, when we got out of the Coliseum in Alexandria that Saturday night at, we were a preliminary match, probably got out at 9 o'clock or whatever. We had to start heading to Oak City. It was 550 miles, and it wasn't even interstate till you got to Shreveport. So there was a few times over the course of the year we had to leave the night before to get to fucking Oak City. And if I'm not mistaken, because I know it was one of these early trips, we're tearing down the road about 15 miles out of Alexandria. The fuzzbuster goes off. Fuck, hit the brakes. Goddamn cop catches me. This was 1984, right? I said $3 to $1. The ticket then was $127 for going 70 at a 55. So that's almost $400 today. And I had to drive another 500 miles. Thinking about that, that was more than I was used to getting paid per night. I had to pay in a ticket. So we get to Oak City. We check in the fucking hotel. $37. We spend $11 on food, and we beat Rick Rude and Joe Savoldi. And remember, we have just been there. New Year's Eve, December 31st. We're back 9 days later, January the 8th. New Year's Eve had been $61,000. This one was $35,000. 2 shows 8 days away from each other. Grossed $100,000 in Oklahoma City in a downtime for the territory. So that's where we knew instantly we were going to love Oklahoma City. I've said on a show the other day, there's always the rotten town in a territory. In the Tennessee territory, it was Tupelo, Mississippi. In Mid-South, it was either Houma, Louisiana, or Laranja, Louisiana. There's also always the best town. And for safety from the fans, for a beautiful new building, for the house always being good and you always being able to make money, I think Oak City was my favorite town in the territory. Questions on Oak City before we move along, because I'm going to catch us up the next week, and that way we'll be even.
Well, beyond that, just the general first week in the territory thoughts. What did you think about the new crew you were working with? JYD was obviously there. Butch Reed. You had a bunch of new people you were working with. Everyone.
Yeah.
You get along with everyone? Was anyone a dick?
Yeah, well, Wrestling 2 was the grumpy old man, but he wasn't. He was one of the more professional guys in the wrestling business because he'd been in it for 30 years, but he was just not a fun-loving guy. But honestly, almost all these guys, everybody, and this is where we first met Dr. Death and Barry Darso, and all these guys loved it. Nikolai Volkov was the biggest jokester. He's the one that would sew the sleeves of my suit jacket together when I was out watching a preliminary match. So when I got ready to go out and try to put my coat on, I couldn't get my hands through the sleeves. And then he did pop the fucking stitches. It was a rib. He didn't hurt anybody's shit. Or he'd have the exercise tube all the guys had, the stretchy rubber tube. You'd stand on it and do curls, and you could pack it easy in your bag. And it's a hollow rubber tube, right? So he would be doing his curls in back of you. And then while you're watching the match, he'd put one end of the tube up next to your ear and he would blow in the other one. Even though it's 8 feet long, he's got the lungs of a goddamn beast. He blows in your fucking ear. You don't know it's, oh shit. He was always having fun. The guys, Butch Reed and JYD like to sit there and fucking knock each other for fun. Oh, you're playing the dozens now. So you had to have fun in the locker room, because if you didn't in this territory, you'd go out of your fucking mind. Guys did anyway. But you're fighting fans that are trying to punch you and hit you with bottles and stab you. And you're driving these ridiculous 2-lane roads through these fucking swamps. And, at 4 o'clock in the morning, you had to have fun in the locker room. So there was not a lot. I mean, it stood out when there was heat amongst the talent. Remember Buddy Landell and Sonny King? That stood out, and everybody'd watch those matches, and everybody'd talk about it because it wasn't that usual at that point in time that guys in the locker room would actually be mad at each other. So we had fun with, most all these guys. Now, every once in a while, and even Dr. Death, and even being good friends with us, and, when substances came into play, fuck it, I'll tell a story. Almost everybody's gone. So Doc gets a new van, a custom, one of those. Remember in the 80s, it was big to get those customized vans with the captain's chairs and the sound systems, and
TV
had
sometimes.
a refrigerator, TV, everything in it. He got this beautiful custom van. He wants all the heels: me, Bobby Eaton, Dennis Condrey, Buddy Landell, Carl Fergie, the referee. May have been one other person. Let's all take the Oklahoma trip. I'll get some boiled shrimp. We'll make a trip out of it. So me and Fergie are in the very back, right? There's like 8 fucking captain's chairs. We're in the very back. We don't know what's going on, but Buddy and Bobby and Dennis and Doc's driving. They're sitting up more toward the front. And all of a sudden, we notice that there's some kind of tension going on up front. Me and Fergie kind of trying to sleep. We're not really paying attention to what's going on. Make a long story short, Doc has overindulged in the Bolivian marching powder, the Tony cocaine special. And he's starting to get grumpy, and he's convinced that one of the people in the van is dipping into his shit. And he's looking in the rearview mirror every 5 seconds. And he's fucking making comments up there that we can't really hear in the back. And I noticed that as he's getting more agitated, Dennis was the one told me about this later on. You remember those old fucking glass iced tea and soft drink bottles had the big necks, and juice bottles and everything. They were plastic. They were glass. Dennis is putting the cap back on that and put it in between his legs in case he needs a fucking weapon. And they're all up there thinking, how the fuck are we going to stop Dr. Death if he goes off? And Doc pulls over on the side of the interstate, gets out, goes around to the back door behind me and Fergie, Fergie is what I'm trying to say, opens the door and rummages around in his bag. And he was checking his cocaine supply again, like we could possibly. And so all the guys up front were ready. Do we all jump him at the same time and try to hit him in the head with a hammer? How are we going to stop this motherfucker if he gets violent? And then he settled down. And, of course, me and Fergie get out when we get to the goddamn building in Oak City and don't know what the fuck is even going on. And Bobby and Buddy and Dennis, and I think, goddamn, may have been, was Ronnie West in the territory at that time? Anyway, they're telling us what happened. Yeah, he was looking for his cocaine. He thought we were stealing it. He was freaking out. He was having a moment. He was vibrating. We didn't know what the fuck we were. Then there was no way if we had to fight him. If any of us lived that we could let him back in the vehicle, we were going to have to leave him on the side of the road. I mean, everybody still thinks brawl for all Dr. Death, but, sorry, fuck that. Everybody was scared of that motherfucker, and these were grown adult men that had been in goddamn bad situations before on purpose. So anyway, but that was a sideline. But anyway, I'll go through the next week very briefly. I just want to call attention to some things. January 9, the Monday night, was Tulsa. That's why it wasn't an Oak City, Tulsa double shot like they normally did on Sundays. They had been off schedule with the Christmas show in Oak City. They came back. They couldn't get the building in Tulsa on a Sunday or whatever the fuck. So they did the Monday night. And this is where we learned that there was a difference in Tulsa and Oak City. For whatever reason, no matter how good Tulsa did, Oak City would double it. And even if Tulsa sold out, Oak City's building was twice as big. And And I don't know what and Tulsa was the base of the office. Bixby was a suburb of Tulsa. That's where Watts was based. And also, even though the house would be less than Oak City, your payoff against a house versus any other town in the territory would be slightly less. And I started noticing this, and I was told by some of the guys that had been there, Watts would take his regular office expenses out of Tulsa. So before he started splitting the money up for the payoffs out of Tulsa, not only did the TV come out, the TV cost or whatever, but the advertising, but also regular office expenses and shit. I don't know if that's true, but
Oklahoma City was a split with Fritz von Erich, right? Was Tulsa too?
No, it wasn't a split. Fritz had a piece of it. Watts owned the majority of both of these towns, but Fritz got had points in the town. I don't know what the percentage was. Was it 10%? Was it 15? Was it whatever? But Fritz had no ownership of it per se, but to supply talent, and because of the fact that Fritz's TV in Dallas and in some of the Oklahoma markets overlapped, they'd come to an amicable agreement that Fritz would get a piece of whatever Oak City did. And probably Tulsa too, maybe not, but probably, because it's the same area. They're only 100 miles apart, and they would run the same day. And if Kerry would be there or Chris Adams or whoever, they'd be at both shows. So it was a financial incentive for Fritz to send guys who were even more over in Oklahoma than they would have been in Jackson, Mississippi, over to Watts's cards. And that's again, these two cities in Oklahoma, the only two cities really in Oklahoma, there's some towns, these are the only two cities, they're 100 miles apart, and they got it to where you could sell 20,000 tickets between the two of them in one day. That was insane for markets of this size. But in the meantime, on January 9th, the house in Tulsa was still a shits, and we got $100. And then we came back on the 10th. We went to Shreveport, which basically we stayed in Tulsa and just picked up Shreveport on the way back, because why are we going to rush back to our hotel rooms? So that's another case where we had a hotel room as a satellite of the hotel room we were staying in. And Shreveport was rude and Savoldi, and it was a $60 payoff. I mentioned on our last segment, the old municipal auditorium there in Shreveport. And it was never a big money town, even when Watts was hot, because it was where they did the TV, and they were there so much, and it wasn't a major market. So we were occupying time there. But, and that's why if a lot of people, if you want to go back, some of the building descriptions or town descriptions or the picadillos of same, I'm not going to repeat it every time. You got to follow this series. And then one of the greatest fucking fiasco bookings that could possibly be done in this territory. We were in Shreveport on Tuesday night, right? For a house show. We get up the next morning, and we've stayed overnight, and we do the local promos, as I've talked about, at KTBS in Shreveport, Channel 3. We do from 9 o'clock in the morning to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Local promos for every market, babyface and heel, that's going to be running over the next week. And you know where we were booked on Wednesday night, Brian? Laranja, Louisiana.
How far is that from Shreveport?
280 miles. And just to make it even more fun, almost none of that was interstate. You had to take the 2-lane from Shreveport to Alexandria, then follow that from Alexandria almost to Baton Rouge to pick up the interstate, where you could then go through Baton Rouge and then off kilter into the goddamn hinterlands of southern Louisiana, where you would find Laranja. And I left Shreveport. I think I met the boys on the way through. I think they were done with local promos by that point, but I couldn't have left Shreveport before 3 o'clock. And the bell time for the town was 7:30. So we literally got in there after the show had started. And this was the Midnight Express's first house show match with Magnum TA and Wrestling 2. Because they booked it in Laranja. Because we never worked with them before and never met them before we got here. So let's take a look at it. Nobody will see it in Laranja. So, and it was basically heat on Magnum, or heat on Wrestling 2. Magnum gets the tag, makes a comeback. They get in a 4-way. The referee double DQs it, and the heels bail. It's a small show in Laranja in front of 500 people. We made $60, but that was for everybody to get acquainted. Well, Bobby and Dennis had met Wrestling 2 in the past, and I would imagine Dennis had probably worked with him. Magnum was new, and so it was a thing to work shit out. And then we went back to Alexandria, which was 150 miles back the exact way we came. And we got ready for the next day. And Laranja, by the way, that I said every town, there's a worse town. Laranja was not the worst town in terms of danger to the heels. It was in terms of a shithole building and a place you didn't want to go that you weren't going to make any money. And it was a building that sat in a mud field with a gravel parking lot, and the boys parked around back in the mud. The dressing room was maybe 5 feet wide and 15 feet long, and you had to get a whole group of heels in that, and the baby faces got the bigger room. And it was so muddy and so wet usually that there was that industrial pallet stuff down on the floor of the locker room so you could walk on that and be above the water for when the toilet backed up or whatever. And in any kind of decent weather, the boys would go out and change clothes in their car behind the building rather than actually change in the locker room. And in intermission, the guy running the building, and this was some kind of political thing to be able to get Baton Rouge and wherever Thibodeau, wherever else the good places, he would run an auction. His merchandise stand looked like a flea market. You could see everything from fucking toys and shotguns to cakes and baked goods to goddamn home furnishings and lamps. And at intermission, he would start either selling shit or auctioning it off. And he wouldn't ring the bell to start the show again until he figured he had made enough money. So as we're standing back there, if you were after intermission, the boys wanted to bid on the shit themselves just to get it over with. And the ring was not only harder than Chinese arithmetic with almost no padding on it and absolutely no give, but it's the only ring I've ever, and this ring was used nowhere else. It was part of his building deal also. The ropes were real ropes and they weren't wrapped. No duct tape, no garden hose, nothing. Fucking ropes. Try hitting those son of a bitches with a bare chest, right? So it was just, it was horrible. And you wanted to get out of there from the time you got there. But it was one of those ones you had to do. So that was Laranja, Louisiana. January 12th, we go to Port Arthur, Texas. It's only 200 miles away from Alexandria, the other direction from Laranja. And again, Port Arthur and Beaumont, Texas were right next to Houston. Houston, one of the great wrestling cities in the world, right? And over the years, Houston, from the 40s through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, business could be up and down, but it never stunk, right? Houston was Houston. Port Arthur and Beaumont couldn't draw 15 cents in Chinese money. And I never figured out why. And they were run off the Houston television. And it was part of Paul Bosch's agreement that that area of Houston they would supply talent for. Port Arthur this night did $7,000. And we actually did the fucking scaffold match in Beaumont. And as I recall, I don't think it did 15 grand. So I don't know why. But fuck Port Arthur and Beaumont, Texas. Except for a young lady that I met in Beaumont one time that I wish I'd have got her phone number. Nevertheless, Port Arthur, as I said, was, they would run it every once in a while, or more often they'd run Beaumont in agreement with Paul Bosch. And that's when Paul's son, Paul's son-in-law, rather, Pete Burkholz, would be in charge of these towns. His nephew, I'm sorry, not son-in-law. Nephew. And that's what Paul was running in those days. His biggest, most important thing was Houston, but occasionally you'd get these towns. But Lanny Poffo and Rick Rude, $75 payoff, and we went on to Houston for the following night, which was another 80 miles. And then, remember, we were in Houston the Christmas week, came back, another good house, $42,000 at the Sam Houston Coliseum. And we were against Lanny Poffo, and I got a kick out of this. Jose Martinez, El Bracero. El Bracero had been somewhat of a name in his time in Mexico, but had moved for whatever reason. Remember, I've told you that one of the most famous luchadors in Mexican wrestling history, Blackie Guzman, ended up as a job guy in Indianapolis in the early 70s. Same thing. I had watched Bruisers TV and watched Jose Martinez, El Bracero, as an underneath guy in Indianapolis for years and years. And he lived up there for a while. And suddenly, here we are working with him. And we beat the shit out of him, too. But that night in Houston, $42,000 house, we're at a preliminary match, $250 payoff. So we could see, boy, when we're at a main event in Houston, when we're in an important match in Houston, this is going to be a big deal. And we got to do the Houston TV and do the stand-ups on the stage, the interviews with Paul Bosch, and rile the people up. And his television in Houston had even stronger a reach than most of Watts's 1-hour Mid-South shows in the other markets. It was a local institution like Memphis wrestling. So we treated Houston from the start with a lot more. You could tell the fans, the reaction, the cheers, the boos, the loudness, what they popped on. It was a wrestling fan crowd. They knew their shit. They knew everybody. And they picked up on subtleties. If you just reached back and started to pull the babyface's hair, they would come up. So they had really been educated superbly because Paul had been in control of that promotion and, educated his fans the way that he wanted them to see wrestling. And it was a pleasure to work in Houston.
Did you get to go to the office?
I went to the office a couple of times. I could have spent 5 years there to look at everything. And I was still timid at that point where I was so impressed. I was just like staring at the shit on the walls without asking him to start opening up drawers or whatever. I didn't want to be a burden, but it was incredible. And the stuff went back to the 30s and one of a kind shit. And it was just everywhere. It covered the walls.
Hey, with Watts, he hired you after watching you at the Mid-South Coliseum, not after hearing you do a promo. What was the reaction when you started doing these local promos and people started seeing the way you talk, which was different than you had never done promos like this before in Memphis?
No. Well, and that's the thing when Watts asked Dennis. He said, "Can Cornette talk?" That's what Dennis told me, and Condrey said, "He can talk his ass off." But I'm sure that Watts he was getting Dennis's feedback also, but I'm sure he'd probably seen some tape, even though I didn't speak that night. I'm sure that he probably went over to Jarrett's house and they'd showed him some local promos, but there wasn't much to show of me at that point, like leading anything or being in charge of anything. But yeah, when I started doing what I started doing, because think about this. None of these guys had really ever heard of me before because I'd only been in the business since September, October of 82, only in the Tennessee territory. VCRs still weren't a big thing. And think about this. The guys did not jump into the VCR revolution like us fans did because they were on the road every night. They weren't taping wrestling. They were on the road wrestling every night. So they didn't see And they didn't trade tapes. So the point is, none of the talent or the local promoters or anybody in Mid-South Wrestling, with the exception of Bobby and Dennis and Dundee, the guys that came from Tennessee, and maybe Lanny, because he'd been able to see the TV up here, had ever fucking heard of me before. And if they had heard of me, if they'd have read the articles in Aptors magazines or whatever, I got a few. That's still like, well, we don't know what he sounds like. So, yeah, that's when they started making these people are going to fucking cut you. They're going to fucking kill you. They're going to burn you. They're going to fucking hang you in effigy. You're a heat-getting machine. And the guys it's never been a thing where guys in the locker room just went up and effusively praised people when they first met them. Like, oh, my God, I can't believe you're so good at that, like they do now, where everybody's going, oh, you're so great. You never got compliments. So I didn't really get a lot of compliments, but Bobby and Dennis would tell me that the other guys would go to them and say, where the fuck did you get this guy from? Especially Wrestling 2, who thought I had to be on the strongest cocaine that was ever invented. But, once that the heels were kind of not disgruntled, but the heels were kind of raising eyebrow at it because they saw that, goddamn, we can't keep up with that promo, and he's got these guys that can work their ass off, so we got competition. But we were all, again, it was the boys, not everybody cutting each other's nuts off. The baby faces, with the exception of the Rock and Roll, they didn't know how sharp I could be, and there was occasionally, what the fuck, when I would delve deep into them, but Watts loved it. He wanted me to get personal. So, they were surprised and they looked at me sideways, but then when we started doing business, they were like, okay, well, Jesus Christ, he can talk. That's it. They were in that territory. They were used to the Scandal Rack bars or the Gary Harts or the ex-wrestlers that, talked like they were ex-wrestlers. And this was different, which is why it was getting over, because the people hadn't seen something like me. I don't know if there were things like me back then. But yeah, they were surprised at first. When they first saw us without seeing them work or hearing me talk, they were like, what the fuck's going on here? But then they got it. But the biggest reaction, Brian, from the boys was not how I can talk or how they can work. They were all trying to take bets on how long it was going to take one of the fans to cut my guts out. That was the big thing. How long is it going to take? They're betting on my continued survival or imminent demise. And that just proves that if you want to bet on something, you could pretty much bet on anything. But I think that was kind of in bad taste for them to wager that I was going to be assassinated. I think you should stick to the football and the basketball and the sporting events and stuff like this, stuff like our friends at DraftKings do. Bet on those things. Don't bet on whether the heel manager is going to get his throat cut or not.
Yeah, let's not bet on that. Let's talk more about the things you can bet on at DraftKings. The things more like what Buck Robley would be betting on, not whatever was happening in that locker room.
Well, Buck Robley, if you were running at a track, whether you were a horse, a dog, or even a two-legged human, Buck Robley would bet on you. But folks, you can bet on anything you want if you download the DraftKings Sportsbook from our friends at DraftKings, because they're an official sports betting partner of the NFL playoffs. And are they still playing off over there in the NFL, Brian?
They're playing off. Yeah.
Well, then you still got time to bet on it. And right now, if you do what we tell you to do, and you always should, then new customers can bet $5 on any game and get $200 instantly in the bonus bets. That's bonuses. That's in addition to. That's a bonus. That's a fortuitous of fucking happening. And it's very lucky for you they're going to do this, because they don't have to do it for everybody, just for the people that download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now and use the code JCE. That's the code to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you bet just a measly $5, just a sawbuck, just an Abraham Lincoln. Even if you're a tightwad, you can afford $5, although I do know that Angelo Poffo pulled a $5 bill out of his wallet one time? It was so old Lincoln was clean shaven. Did you know that?
I did not know that. I don't know why we had to go after Angelo Poffo here.
Well, he's the most miserly son of a bitch I can think of. But anyway, download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use the code JCE. $5, you bet on the game, you get 200 in bonus bets. And that's because the crown is yours with our friends at DraftKings. Of course, now other things may apply. If you've got a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER or visit www.1800gambler.net. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling or problem spot copy. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Letters, phrases, and loud noises. Please play responsibly. Or don't play at all. Goddamn, we've given you an ultimatum. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas, something is going to happen here. 21 plus age varies by jurisdiction, void in Ontario, as always. Bonus bets expire 168 hours after issuance. See dkng.com/football. For eligibility and deposit restrictions, terms, and responsible gaming resources. DraftKings. Our friends.
Right. Our friends at DraftKings, the official betting partner of the Jim Cornette Experience.
Yes, they're official. Now we've deemed them such. We have knighted them with the officialness of our partner.
Well, in terms of official, we have from the official schedule about 3 more weeks to go for January, so let's get going.
Oh, good Lord. We're not going to go all the way through January. We're just going to catch up a little bit with a couple more days, and at least we've put in some time here. Because on Saturday, January 14th, remember I said there's always a shitty town and Laranja's it? Remember I mentioned another town? Houma, Louisiana. At the Houma Rec Center, and somebody sent me a picture. It's still there. I believe they sent it not too long ago. It's 400 miles round trip from Alexandria, which we're doing on a Saturday there. And we're going down to wrestle Lanny Poffo and Rick Rude. And the house was $6,000. And it wasn't going to get much better in Houma either, because the capacity of the building, I think we ended up selling out maybe 12 grand or whatever. But this was another one of those political ones for some reason. This was the place where if you were going to get hurt by the fans, there was a high probability it was going to be Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Houma, Louisiana, or potentially maybe Lake Charles and sometimes Little Rock. And Biloxi was not good, but Houma would be worse because it was a small building with a dark parking lot. You had to park with the fans. Of course, a lot of times we got there, the doors were already open, the people were in the building, but leaving was an issue if you had heat. And it was a spot show, so most of the time they didn't do too many hot finishes, but occasionally it would happen. And then, like I said, it was a rec center. Imagine like a rec center with a basketball court, and there's a small balcony on 2 sides where people can be up, watching from above. And you're putting chairs in this thing. And when you came in from the parking lot, you had to enter into the building, the basketball court area. And then you had to go into the locker room that had only one door. There was no back door to the locker room. So once you got in the locker room, technically you were trapped. You could not leave without going through the fans, which is why when they did do a hot finish, and the fans were pissed, nobody was allowed to leave the heel locker room until the police could get the fucking building cleared. And so they put a fucking cop in front of the door, and they said, lock this door and don't open it until we come back. And so you're locked in a fucking concrete block room with whoever knows how many people plotting to do whoever knows what to you outside, and the only way you can get out of this room is either through the door into the people, or if you could squeeze through a 12-inch by fucking 12-inch window about 8 feet off the ground in the back of the room that gave the only ventilation for this thing. So every night that we were in the main event, we would be locked into this fucking closet until the cops came and knocked on the door and said, okay, you can leave. And then they would let us go out to the back, and if we were lucky, they would walk us to our car. But there was one night that they didn't walk us to our car. I've told you the story. This is where this was, Houma, Louisiana. Dundee is the booker. Bobby Eaton has decided to ride back to Alexandria with Bill Dundee because Dundee was by himself. Leaves me and Dennis in my car by ourselves. And Dundee and Bobby got out of there, but as we get to our car, Dennis is putting his bag in the trunk, and here comes these 7 or 8 guys that are disgruntled, Cajun types, making fucking trouble, saying some shit, and I'm like, okay, now it's in a dark parking lot, me, Dennis Condrey, I'm carrying a tennis racket, and that's all we got. And the lead guy mouths off to Dennis. Dennis says something about fuck you. The guy takes an unopened beer can and tries to chuck it at Dennis and hit him in the face with it. Dennis ducks that, grabs the guy's left wrist, Fujiwara arm bars this motherfucker into the gravel and boots him in the face. That guy's neutralized. The other 6 are not happy. And just then, I'm like, oh, fuck. And here we see headlights and a car horn. The Rock and Roll Express have gotten their car on the other side of the parking lot, seen that we're about to get killed, fired the car up, turned the bright lights on, and are driving in between me and Dennis and the fucking crowd of guys, which we took as the opportunity to jump in the car and get the fuck out of there. So they were technically kind of breaking kayfabe in that they did save our lives, but at the same point, they could just say, hey, it was dark and we didn't know which way was out. And we drove the wrong way. Boy, we wish you'd have got him. But in Houma also, Dr. Death and Hercules Hernandez did something with the Rock and Roll when I was managing them. Some finished with the Rock and Roll that, I think, October, November-ish. I had Dr. Death's football helmet, right? I carried it. Instead, that's after they had banned my tennis racket. And the fans started coming after Doc and Herc as we were on our way back to the locker room. And instead of trying to fight our way back through the crowd, we had gotten through ringside and we're at the back of the ringside section and we're almost home free when the ringsiders started rushing us from behind. So Doc and Herc turned around and we were backing up toward the locker room fighting. And Doc would throw one way, and Herc would throw one the other way, and if one peeked through, I'd whack him over the head with that fucking hard-ass college football helmet. And we got back in the fucking locker room, and they locked us in there again, and we had to stay there for about 45 minutes or an hour till the cops that were on the scene could clear the place out. So you would go down there for between $75 and $100, and you would risk getting fucking cut or attacked or stabbed or run over in the parking lot or whatever, because you had to run that town so you could run other bigger towns in that parish and part of the area. And that was Houma. And then finally, I'll finish up on January 15th, on a Sunday afternoon. Remember I said we were in Alexandria on January 7th? Came back a week later. On Sunday afternoon, January 15th, and whereas we had beaten Lanny and Savoldi in Alexandria the previous week, we beat Rude and Savoldi, and the house was up from from 8,800, it was down to 8,100, and we got another $100, and that was just in time for us to get out of there and make a 200-mile round trip up the road to Monroe, Louisiana, at the Monroe Civic Center, where that was another secondary market, but a nice big building that, was there for some reason. And we did $8,800 there and got paid another $80. Well, the point is, we're going all over the goddamn place, but we wrestled nothing but preliminary matches and did the TV angle. And we made $825 that week, which is the equivalent of $2,500 in today's money on these down houses. And by the way, Monroe, that's another one of those towns. I can't remember what came up the other day, but I was going to bring this up, and I don't think that I brought it up because we got in a different direction. But you talk about sometimes something that's done in wrestling gets buried by not being sold. Nobody would know what it's like to fucking be Spanish flied off the top rope, whether it would kill you or not, except that, if you sell it, it's dangerous, right? But if you pop right back up, well, that wasn't anything. Well, in Monroe, Louisiana, I'll never forget this because this is the only time this fucking happened. They had the scaffold match when we were ready to leave the territory with the Midnight and the Rock and Roll. And every night where they had the scaffold, they had to set up the fucking scaffolding on the outside of the ring, and they had to get the ladder and the walk board and everything across. So they would use, maintenance people or what's the word I'm searching for? Building employees that worked in that kind of field where they did maintenance and they did work around the building, right? Or they just pick some people up, say, hey, come in here, you get 4 free tickets, help us put up this equipment. And that usually went okay, but one night in Monroe, we're back there, intermission before the scaffold match. We're watching them put the thing up. Bobby and Dennis always like to make sure that it looked like it wasn't going to fall over before they climbed it. And guess what one of the guys working on the scaffold did, Brian?
What's that?
He was up there on the top of it, and after they finished getting the ladders tied down and the railing on the sides and everything was all buttoned up, instead of climbing back down like everybody else everywhere every time, he leaned over the side of the ladder, grabbed the ladder underneath, hung from it, and dropped to the fucking ground in the ring below and walked off, just like we were going to do.
What?
He hung from below the ladder and dropped and landed on his feet in the ring and walked off. Took the fucking bump the guys were going to take later on and sell without even a fucking bobble.
So it'd be like you doing the Starrcade 86 bump and just landing on your feet and walking out.
And just landing and walking off. And he was he didn't know what the fuck he was doing. He's like, well, it's quicker for me to get down this way. He was an athletic spry sort. And we're like, God damn, we're glad everybody's getting a beer, right? But anyway, so that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 house shows and a 6-hour set of interviews in 7 days in the Louisiana territory, and that was not even a long trip week. But now we've got to the middle of January, and it's starting to get interesting because it will be only the next Wednesday where we shoot the first major angle on television that we would do, and also debut at a couple more interesting towns and get into the main event picture over the second half of the month. So we're going to do that coming up here shortly because this month is almost over. Hold it. Where does the time go? Just every 40 years, it seems like only yesterday.